And I'm going to spotlight you, Tony.
What does that mean?
It just means if they want your full screen, they
Oh,
want to stay in gallery view, you're not.
okay. So I thought I wanted to talk about the Paramis tonight. Is there anybody who isn't
It's a
familiar?
little soft. Can you up your sound?
That's pretty much it.
That's good.
Okay. Um, I wanted to talk about the Paramis tonight, and I wanted to see if there's anybody who's not familiar with them, whether I need to introduce them to anybody. If you're already familiar, I'll just move, assuming that you have a general familiarity, and if not, I'll introduce them.
Is that the same as the Paramitas?
Yeah, there are. That's it.
Okay.
Yeah, there are 10 of them. Mary Helen has put in the chat the list of them in Pali. In the Theravadan tradition, there are 10 of them. But I wanted to talk about how to cultivate them because usually they're introduced and we all think they're good ideas and that we ought to be more like that. And it's very edifying. But how do you actually cultivate them? And I want to talk about cultivating them with the kind of tool that we have that the Buddha gave us, which is mindfulness. So, as in advance, I want to talk a little bit about, well, if you look at the paramis, they're the perfections of a Buddha. They're the perfection, and these are the qualities that the Buddha, the tradition is, it's, 100 mahakalpas or whatever, mahakalpas for him to perfect these qualities. And if you look at them, they all look like things that you could say are the perfections of a Buddha. But the opposite of these, or the lack of these, is dukkha. The Buddha came to the end of dukkha. These qualities are the qualities of one who has, at least in the mythology, who has attained the end of the path. Um, and often they're introduced and we all think we should be more like them. Thich Nhat Hanh has an interesting comment. He says that when we navigate by the North Star, but we don't actually go to the North Star. We navigate, but we navigate by our notion of nibbana, for example, but we don't actually. I mean, it's a notion, it's a vision, it's a guiding idea. And so the idea here is that these 10 qualities could serve as guidance, but there's no practice there. Excuse me. There isn't a practice. I mean, you can tell yourself to have more energy. How does that work? Telling yourself to be mindful is not the same thing as being mindful. Telling yourself to let go is not the same thing as letting go. So how do we practice these qualities which we aspire to? Because, for example, the first of them is giving. And it's interesting, this is the only one of the 10 that's an actual action. Dana means giving and not generosity. Generosity in Pali, the word is chagga, C-A-G-G-A. So how do we cultivate giving? Well, we have a lot of opportunities that we make available, and we, dana to a teacher, dana to the center. We live in a culture of dana in the Dharma scene, and those are opportunities, and they come up once in a while. What I'd like to do is to talk about how to cultivate the paramis as a meditation practice, because the Buddha said what we wanted to do is to understand dukkha. That's our task. That's the first task that comes with the first noble truth. Understand dukkha. And so understand the absence of the paramis, because the absence of the paramis is dukkha in each of these cases. Now mindfulness, mindfulness is the practice that the Buddha outlined, and one of the aspects of mindfulness that doesn't get talked about a lot, that's been identified by scholars particularly, but it doesn't have a name, so they've labeled it with what's a cumbersome name, which is intentionally conjuring concepts. So when you, for example, want to think about loving kindness for all beings, you're not in the presence of all beings. The idea of all beings is in your mind, and you've created that concept, that notion, that vision, and you work on bringing the feelings of loving kindness to that vision. In the Satipatthana Sutta, for example, the Buddha, in the section on mindfulness of the body, there's a passage where he urges you to contemplate your internal organs. The blood and the kidneys and the spleen and all that kind of stuff. That's not something that you're directly observing, it's something you're thinking about. And even the meditations on the corpses in the charnel grounds, those aren't, it's not that you're supposed to observe the color and the smell and the sensory. It's you're supposed to be thinking about the transitoriness of things, and about the how our bodies are all on loan. So these kinds of things, Ajahn Amaro has taught this kind of a practice at times. I've heard him teach this 2 times, maybe 3, and the way he does it, and it's actually kind of cute. He'll say, okay, you get yourself sitting and your breath is going and the mindfulness is coming and things are calm. He says, when you've got that going, bring an idea into your mind and watch the resonances that flow from it. And both times that I heard him teach this, the example that he had as spring to mind was mother, which I thought was kind of cute. But the idea is to bring something to mind. John Peacock teaches metta practice this way. Attempt to conjure metta for someone, and watch the resistance that comes up. There are some people for whom metta is easy to evoke, and some for whom it's difficult. Study the difficult. Make metta practice a mindfulness practice. So in this sense, what we're trying to do is, while we're sitting, to intentionally bring to mind experiences and explore them mindfully. So I think I talked to you last month about this. This is all coming out of this experience that I talked to you about last month, where I was driving to the supermarket at 6:15 in the morning and zipping along, and came up behind somebody who was doing 20 and a 25 when I was feeling like a 35 and a 25 kind of guy. And you know what that feels like? It's a physical feeling. And I hadn't realized that I was in a hurry, but all of a sudden I was in a hurry, I realized. And it was a physical feeling, when you're in a traffic jam, when you're in a hurry. And can you guys have those? Anybody? It's not just me, right? So, you can bring to mind that feeling and make that feeling the object of your attention as an object of mindfulness, object of mindful attention. So one of the ways of studying, of cultivating patience, is to study impatience. And you don't have to wait till you're standing in line at a supermarket and you find impatience arising. you can bring to mind your own experiences of impatience and study them. Recall the physicality, recall the situation, and you can experience the pleasantness and unpleasantness of it. We've talked about the V meter, right? Everybody know about how to measure your feeling tone. So, okay, let me just run through it quickly. So if you go to the doctor and the doctor says, on a scale of 0 to 10, how's your pain? You can do that. It's not a precision thing, but it's a subjective measure. It's a method of bringing mindful attention to your pain. You can also do it with pleasant experience. On a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being the most pleasurable and 0 being meh, where would you put, seriously, vanilla ice cream? Where would you put yams? Different from the vanilla ice cream? My favorite is bringing to mind rubbing my dog. She's soft and furry. She loves to be rubbed. I love to rub her. It's great. That's right up there about an 8. So you can, everybody able to do this, so you can set this whole thing to a scale where -10 is the worst pain and +10 is the most pleasurable and 0 is neutral, the neutral point. And so you can turn your attention to any object. You can turn it to how you're feeling right now. If you pay close attention, is your experience pleasant right now? Little bit, 1 or 2, maybe you're uncomfortable, maybe could be a -1, -2 is probably pretty much near center line. But you can measure anything. I used to walk, as I walked to the prison in the spring, it's about a 1/4 mile walk, and it would be warm and it would be wonderful, and I was moving right along, and I would measure that as a 6 or it's just wonderful, 7 maybe. It was just great. But you can also, when it's raining and cold, you can go, oh, -2, -3. So I urge you to use this. You can use this as a measuring device. It's a second foundation of mindfulness practice to bring to your attention your feeling tone. But you can use this to measure anything that you bring to your mind. So, for example, I'm assuming nobody's actually not working with this at this point. Bring to your mind, what is the feeling tone on that scale of -10 to +10, Barack Obama? How do you feel about him? Think of him and see where that, it could be a gauge or a dial or however you want to imagine it. Now imagine the former guy. Bring to mind Donald Trump and measure your feeling about him. It's probably different. We can measure anything we put in our consciousness this way, and we can monitor our thought stream and measure the thought stream as it passes. So this is the kind of mindfulness I'm talking about when I talk about cultivating the Paramis. Giving, where you can have opportunities for giving like we do, but you can also study your own stinginess. Just study it, observe it. You can imagine it when you're on the cushion. You can observe it in the wild, in your life, but you can bring it up on a cushion. You can bring the idea in your mind. We pass people on our way out of parking lots at the supermarkets. And what if you recognize one of those people as your friend? Be a totally different response than it is with the person who's there. We can study our Study that feeling. Take a look at it. Bring it to mind. Be mindful of it. Study our stinginess, not just with money and material things, but with time and attention. You know? The way we study, the way we cultivate giving is by studying our resistance to giving. Sila is, this is really a big one because it's the heart of the practice: right speech, right action, right livelihood. And for me, that's what the whole practice is about. It's about living, speech, action, assembling your life, living without dukkha. The Eightfold Path is the path of living without suffering. That's the goal. The rest of the path is support for that. First patriarch, Zen patriarch, was asked what the essence of Zen was. And he answered, an appropriate response. Appropriate response given the context. You have to take the context into account. So what we're recollecting here when we're sitting, we're recollecting examples of our intentions. There is actually this kind of mindfulness, just to back up a second, this kind of mindfulness has a word in Pali. It's anusati, sati at the end. It's the idea of recollecting. The recollecting becomes a meditation practice, and then we study it. Right speech, right action, right livelihood does not make things worse. We can recall incidents where our behavior made things worse for ourselves and others, and we can look at that. I've got things in my past, in my memory, that I can recall that still make me cringe 50 years later. It's just amazing. We've all got some of those things. Once we recognize that, we don't do that kind of stuff again once we notice it. But the idea here is to bring our attention to those kinds of things, recall them and study them. Nekama, which is renunciation. How do you bring renunciation to mind? You can tell yourself, let go, let go, let go, but the mindfulness observation at that moment is the holding on, that you're holding on, and mindfulness would study the holding on. So, to study renunciation, I'm not a fan of the word renunciation anyway. It refers to greed, hatred, and delusion, renunciation of upadana. And renunciation's got some aversion in that word for me. I like the word abstain. I prefer the word abstain better. So abstain from the objects of grasping. And the objects of grasping, the objects of greed, while you're sitting on the cushion, think of things you want. Things that would be good, things would be conditions that would be nice, not just objects of desire, but experiences that would be desirable. To think to recall hatred, Schadenfreude is hard to resist often, particularly these days as the indictments are lining up. I'm sorry. But that's, Schadenfreude, taking pleasure in the suffering of others. We can find situations where we enjoy others getting taught a lesson or getting there. Bring that to mind. You can study your own aversion in that. How else are you going to cultivate a nekama, renunciation, abstention? And then as far as delusion, boy, we think we know what's going on, although I've offered at almost every teaching opportunity recently, I've offered if anybody has an idea of what's happening. I mean, really, how did we get here? What is this? what's going on. You know, nobody really has an idea, and yet we'll get into quarrels about it. We'll get into disputes about not just what's going on cosmically, just in terms of this experience, what is it, but we'll get into disputes and arguments about politics and perceptions and preferences and the way people should be. None of those arguments, the Buddha said, I teach a Dharma that does not dispute with anyone. So whatever it is that if you find an argument happening, a dispute going on, whatever it's about, it's not about the Dharma, as the Buddha understood it. So we can bring examples of those when we were quarreling or when we were longing for something, wishing for something. Panya, which is translated as wisdom generally. There are people who think that that's a crummy translation, that the word means deep insight. Insight, that moment where you go, oh, and how do you study that? How do you cultivate that? Jack Kornfield used to say, probably still does, he said, insight is an accident and our job is to make ourselves accident prone. You can't tell yourself, have an insight and have it happen. Anybody can do that? What about wisdom? Be wise, be smarter. You can tell yourself those things, but how do you cultivate it? We study our delusions. And our delusions, of course, you can use the same practice recalling arguments and disputes. You can also recall complaints, because complaints come from us about the nature of the way things are. Really what we're dealing with is delusion. Dogen said, enlightenment is enlightenment about delusion, and delusion is delusion about enlightenment. Enlightenment is just about we recognize that what we think we know is provisional, it's heuristic, it's functional, but it's probably not the way things are. The sky is blue because that's how our neurology interprets the frequency of the photons hitting our retina, but good grief, there's a range of radiation that we can't perceive at all. Is the sky blue? Christopher Titmuss, one of my earliest teachers, used to say, everything you think is wrong. Which he was a kind of provocateur. But, paying attention to our delusion is the way we cultivate wisdom. Just to notice the way we cling to ideas about how things are. Virya is energy. How do you cultivate that? You can aspire to having more energy. It's the third element of the factors of enlightenment, factors of awakening. Virya is, but have more energy. How do you pump yourself up? Athletes go out and they try to crank themselves up, and how helpful is that as a model? But you can observe what's the opposite. What's the absence of energy? Sloth and torpor. One of the hindrances. It's a mental thing. It's not just tired. The best example I've ever heard that illustrates it is when you've got the 10-year-old kid in a room and you say it's time to clean up the room. And it's, oh, I just can't, I'm so tired too, can't do it. So I guess, but what about, going down for some ice cream? Oh yeah, all of a sudden the energy's there. So it's a mental thing. So Virya is about mental energy. How do you cultivate that? One of the, you bring your attention to the lack of energy. And you can use the V meter for that. On a scale of 0 to 10, how much energy have you got? 10 being, about to explode, and 0 being totally flat. Mary Helen, you're muted, but if you want to say something, please.
No, I'm sorry. I tend to wave my hand around. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. I thought you were, that's fine.
I had hand surgery and it just,
Well, it's working. Your hand surgery is successful. So, bringing your attention to your lack of energy, and that doesn't mean no energy, and it probably doesn't mean too much energy, but measuring the appropriateness of your energy, that's bringing mindful attention and investigation, which is the second factor of awakening, and the third is energy. Third is energy, because as you become interested in the object of mindful study, energy shows up. Oh, it's interesting. Oh, what is that? So you can observe the kinds of things that are present, and you can recall moments when you felt fatigued. I'm talking about this as a practice on the cushion. Now, Kanti, impatience, talked about a little bit about impatience. And as I was starting to explore this for myself, impatience, I started to think that all dukkha is about impatience. That in a sense, it's just not being content with the way things are and wanting to get on to the next thing, which will be better. And of course, there's a physicality to pushing, wanting, and you can feel that, recalling instances of that. Satya, which is translated as truthfulness, there's a lot about there. A lot of Dharma teaching has rule-based ethics in it. So we're not supposed to speak falsely, but that's not necessarily the most appropriate response. First Patriarch said an appropriate response. I think I've told you guys the experience of my friend Lynn, who's a Buddhist chaplain and does hospice work, and she had been working with this woman for 6 weeks, and they'd become friendly. And Lynn was with her in the morning of the day, as it turned out, that she was going to die. And she was tidying up and doing this and that, and the woman said to her, "I know you're a Buddhist chaplain, but you do believe in Jesus Christ and the resurrection, don't you?" And Lynn said, "Of course." And said you could see this woman relax because she didn't want her friend to go to hell. And she believed, and so Lynn gave her peace. And so the compassionate response there wasn't necessarily the truthful response. So truthfulness is really about recognizing your intentions, not whether there's some objective truth somehow. I'm not even sure what objective truth would be. The sky is blue. We sort of talked about that. All things are impermanent. Great. We can go with impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, no independent nature, no self. And after that, aditana, which is translated as determination, resolve. It's like, how do you do that? There's a difference between a resolve and a wish. I wish I could lose weight versus I'm on a diet. Or I wish I could stop smoking versus I've quit. There's differences between wishes and resolves. Determination is resolve is a determination. Wish is not. So if you want to cultivate determination and focus, which, will address sloth and torpor too. Um, well, we want to study the way the mind is scattered among a whole variety of wants. We can look at our wishes, things we would like, and not tell ourselves that we should be more determined, but study the lack of determination. Bring to mind the situations where we wobble and become familiar with that. The Buddha said, understand dukkha. And this is, the perfection would be the transcendence of dukkha, the abandonment, leaving dukkha behind. But other than that, this reflects a dimension of our experience that we can study with mindfulness rather than with trying to persuade ourselves, and talk ourselves into one of these things. Metta, our general practice of cultivating metta is to incline the mind by repeating phrases and trying to conjure metta. But the opposite of metta, the absence of metta, would be the presence of, aversion, anger, hatred even. You want to cultivate metta. We can recall, we can use metta as a guiding star, like Thich Nhat Hanh says. We can think of how we feel about our benefactors much more than we feel about our antagonists. But to cultivate metta, we can study our aversion, our aversions, our resistances. Sharon Salzberg once said the power of metta is so great that when you try to conjure it, you bring up everything that stands in its way. So it becomes present to your mind to study. You can use complaint as a measure here. You can think of people that you have antipathy for and study that. In the last upekkha, I think I've said in the past, a major change in my practice happened when I saw John Peacock write on the whiteboard at the Berry Center for Buddhist Studies, Nibbana equals upekkha. Nibbana is equanimity. And equanimity not in the sense of flat, non-affective. Krishnamurti was a man of apparently significant charismatic power, that being in his presence, people could feel his presence. And someone asked him once, and he set up the community in Ojai. So he was an Indian sage who had some following. And somebody asked him once what the secret was to his demeanor, and he said, "My secret? I don't mind what happens." And not minding what happens is not the same thing as not caring about what happens. It's if what happens is painful, out of compassion we address the pain, not out of aversion, not out of minding. Telling ourselves not to mind, don't mind this court decision, don't mind that political event, don't mind the heat, don't mind that doesn't work. I shouldn't mind it. Well, that just sets up judgment and unpleasantness. It means appropriate response. So we can go through these 10 qualities, the 10 perfections, recognizing that those are the perfections, and the absence of those perfections is one extent or another dukkha, and we can study it, which is what the Buddha told us to do. Not just in the wild when it comes up, somebody cuts in on us and anger shows up, and we can, I mean, you can't always study it in the wild. So during meditation, we can use this. Let me just end here and open for some discussion with the thought that has occurred to me as I've been thinking about the Paramis, is why compassion isn't on that list. So let me just see what you think of this as a practice method, a practice technique, as some way to approach the cultivation of the Paramis. Any thoughts, reactions?
Could compassion not be on the list because it's metta for people who are suffering?
I'm sorry?
I think of compassion as metta for people who are suffering.
Yeah, compassion is what arises when you recognize, and that includes yourself. I mean, instead of treating some unpleasantness that befalls you with frustration and anger and irritation, you can respond out of compassion and kindness, address the pain. You know. So yeah, it's is that you waving, Jim? No.
He must have had hand surgery too.
He had hand surgery too.